On a bitterly cold January morning, when the world seemed covered in a thick layer of snow, Walter Jensen was trudging down the empty street with his worn boots crunching on the ice beneath him. The bitter wind cut through his overcoat as if it had a mission to chill him to the bone. It was one of those mornings when everything felt still and quiet, the kind of silence that enveloped everything, making the world feel more distant and isolated. He was on his usual walk, a routine he had followed for years, long before the streets had become so desolate with the kind of cold that made even the trees look frozen and lifeless. Walter was a man who had seen more winters than most would care to count. In his 75 years, he had experienced enough of life's harsh realities, building houses, burying old friends, and raising his daughter on his own after his wife had passed. He had long since made peace with the absence of noise in his life. His house was small, tucked away at the edge of Maple Hollow, with a steep roof that had seen better days and a warm wood stove that never stopped burning. Walter's life had become a quiet one, filled with the mundane tasks of living, chopping firewood, fixing leaks, and keeping the roof from caving in. He was a man who lived for practical things, and in his mind, grand gestures didn't make a man. It was the quiet, unnoticed acts of kindness that truly mattered. It was on one of these long, solitary walks that Walter's eyes caught something strange at the bus stop ahead. At first, he thought it was just some discarded trash, perhaps an old bag or a pile of newspapers thrown out by the wind. But as he drew closer, something inside him shifted. There, curled beneath the bench, was what appeared to be a dog. Its body was shaking violently, and its fur was wet and matted with snow. The poor animal had clearly been left to suffer alone in the freezing cold, abandoned in a place where no one would have noticed it unless they were looking carefully enough. Its eyes were hollow, lifeless, as if it had given up hope on ever finding warmth again. Walter stopped in his tracks, unable to turn away. His breath came out in sharp white clouds in the cold air, but his gaze remained fixed on the creature lying in the snow. The dog's trembling body seemed so fragile, so vulnerable, and Walter felt an instant surge of sympathy. It wasn't just the cold that gripped him. It was the loneliness that radiated from the dog's eyes, a loneliness that felt all too familiar to Walter. He had seen his share of pain in his life, the kind of pain that wasn't visible to the world but existed deep inside, the kind of pain that no one asked about and no one ever saw. Walter didn't stop to think or analyze the situation. His heart had already made its decision. Without a second thought, he approached the bench, bending down slowly as the snow crunched beneath his boots. The dog didn't move, too weak to react to the presence of another living being. Walter hesitated for just a moment, taking off his thick wool scarf and gently wrapping it around the animal's shivering body. He could feel the coldness in its fur, the thinness of its frame, the way it shook with each breath, as though its body couldn't even keep itself warm anymore. "Hey there," Walter said softly, his voice gruff but full of a quiet tenderness. "You're not alone anymore." He carefully scooped the dog into his arms, lifting it gently as though it were the most fragile thing in the world. Its small, malnourished body barely weighed anything. Walter could feel its bones beneath the thin coat of fur, and it was clear to him that this dog had been starving for some time. His heart ached for the poor creature abandoned in a place like this to die alone. The dog didn't resist, as if it had given up all hope of survival. Its body remained limp in Walter's arms as he made his way back home. The snow continued to fall around him in thick, lazy flakes, but for Walter, it felt as though time had slowed down. He was no longer just walking down a quiet street. He was carrying something precious, something that needed him. It was a strange feeling, this sense of responsibility he had never anticipated. He wasn't sure if he was doing the right thing, but something deep inside told him that he couldn't leave the dog behind. No living creature deserved to die alone in the snow. Walter's home was only a few blocks away, but it felt like the longest walk of its life. The air was biting, his hands frozen from holding the dog, but he refused to let go. He couldn't help but think of how the dog must have felt, abandoned in the cold, with no one to help. He felt a pang of guilt, not for himself, but for the world that had allowed this to happen. How could someone just leave a helpless animal to die like that? The thought was too much to bear. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Walter reached his modest house. He didn't have much, but it was warm and welcoming, and it was his. The old wood stove in the corner of the living room was already glowing, sending out its comforting warmth. Walter pushed open the door with his shoulder, careful not to disturb the dog too much in his arms. Inside, he laid the dog down on a pile of old blankets near the fire where it could warm up. He filled a small bowl with warm broth, hoping to soothe the dog's aching body. For a while, the animal didn't move, simply staring at the wall in front of it with eyes that seemed so much older than they should have been. There was something haunting about those eyes, as though they had seen too much of the world's cruelty. It wasn't until the evening, after the dog had finally drunk the warm broth, that Walter noticed something odd. As he examined the dog more closely, he saw the leather collar that had once been tightly fitted around its neck, now removed and discarded on the floor. He picked it up, and his fingers brushed against the monogrammed letters etched into the leather, a delicate, cursive C. The collar was expensive, elegant, and far too clean to belong to a stray. Walter's heart sank as the realization hit him. This dog hadn't been lost. It had been left behind, abandoned by someone who could afford the finest things, but couldn't spare the kindness to care for an innocent creature. The night settled in around Walter's small house, the crackling fire in the stove, the only sound in the room. He stared at the collar in his hand, deep in thought. How could someone do this? How could they abandon such a loyal, trusting animal? Walter didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let the dog's story end like this. Not while there was still something he could do. Walter's kindness. Walter Jensen had always believed that the true measure of a man wasn't found in the grand gestures or the showy acts of kindness that the world often applauded. No, Walter believed that it was in the small, unnoticed things that a person truly revealed their character. He lived his life this way, quietly, with purpose, doing what needed to be done without waiting for thanks or praise. He wasn't the kind of man who sought recognition, nor was he the kind of man to be swayed by the flashy promises of wealth or fame. To Walter, those things were fleeting, hollow, and often shallow. His house, though small, was a testament to this belief. The furniture was old, but well cared for. The wood stove in the corner of the living room, constantly fed with logs, and the worn floorboards creaked beneath his boots, a familiar sound that echoed through his simple home. It was warm here, not just in the sense of temperature, but in the kind of warmth that came from living a life that prioritized integrity, even when no one was looking. Walter had no family left, except for the quiet memories of his wife and daughter. His daughter had grown up, moved away, and had a life of her own now. His wife, Carol, had passed away several years ago, leaving him to navigate the world alone. But he had learned to live with that loneliness, as many people do. It didn't bother him as much as it might have bothered others. He had his work, his routines, and now a growing sense of responsibility for the dog he had found on that cold January morning. When Walter saw the dog trembling under the bus-stop bench, he had known instinctively that it couldn't just be left there. There was no hesitation in his actions, no second-guessing or waiting for someone else to step forward. He didn't stop to wonder if the dog had an owner, or if it was sick, or if it would somehow put him at risk. Walter was a man who trusted his instincts, and his instincts told him to act. There was no question in his mind that he had to help this animal, even if he didn't know what the future held. He wasn't foolish. He understood that helping a strayed dog wasn't the most logical decision. After all, he was no spring chicken, and his house wasn't exactly set up for taking in a pet, especially one that had likely been abandoned by someone with wealth and no sense of empathy. Walter didn't need to be reminded that animals could be a lot of work, especially sick or neglected ones, but something inside him, a sense of decency perhaps, or a quiet yearning for connection, told him that this was the right thing to do. This dog needed him, and that was enough. As he carried the dog in his arms, Walter felt a strange sense of purpose, like he had just been given a second chance at something he didn't even know he had lost. It was more than just the act of carrying the dog to his home. It was the fact that he was doing something that mattered. And for someone like Walter, who had spent so many years quietly doing his work, fixing things, building houses, and taking care of what was in front of him, this small act of kindness felt like a reaffirmation of everything he had believed in. It wasn't the big things that counted, but the small, quiet moments that added up to something more. When he got home, he didn't waste any time. He didn't sit and think about whether the dog would be a good companion or whether he had the time or resources to care for it. Walter wasn't the type of man to overthink things, especially when it came to matters of kindness. He simply acted. He placed the dog on a pile of blankets near the wood stove and set about preparing a bowl of warm broth, something simple but comforting. The fire crackled gently in a corner, sending flickers of light dancing across the room, and Walter watched as the dog, still weak and exhausted, slowly began to drink. It wasn't much at first, but it was enough to show Walter that the dog wasn't beyond saving. There was still life in it, still the chance for something good. Walter didn't rush the dog's recovery. He didn't expect it to heal overnight, but he knew that it would need time. And time, as Walter had learned over the years, was often the most important factor in healing. Just as he had learned to rebuild houses from the ground up, he would rebuild this dog step by step with patience, care, and a steady hand. In the days that followed, Walter's kindness didn't stop at just providing warmth and food for the dog. He made sure the dog had a place to sleep, a quiet corner near the stove where it could rest and recover. He checked on it regularly, speaking softly to it as he went about his daily routines, not in baby talk, but with the kind of quiet companionship that spoke volumes. He didn't know if the dog understood him, but it didn't matter. It wasn't the words that mattered, it was the presence. He didn't name the dog right away. To Walter, naming something was a gesture of permanence, and he wasn't ready to make that leap yet. He had seen too many things in his life that hadn't lasted, too many people and animals that had come and gone, to rush into making something feel permanent. The dog wasn't a possession. It wasn't something to be owned or controlled. It was simply something that needed him, and that was enough. Walter's actions were simple, but they spoke volumes. They were the kind of actions that went unnoticed by most people, but were the very foundation of who he was. He didn't expect thanks, and he didn't need recognition. He didn't care about anyone else's opinion. What mattered to Walter was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had done the right thing, that he had chosen to stand up when others might have turned away. It was in this small act of kindness that Walter found something he hadn't known he was missing. The dog, though still a stranger to him, had become something more than just an animal in need. It had become a reminder that sometimes the simplest acts of kindness are the most powerful. And perhaps, just perhaps, the dog had something to teach him as well, that it was never too late to make a difference, never too late to show compassion, and never too late to learn that sometimes the greatest rewards come from giving without expecting anything in return. As the dog continued to regain strength, Walter's life began to shift in subtle ways. He found himself thinking more about the future, wondering how long the dog would stay with him and whether he would ever truly name it. He found himself talking to the dog more, not in a way that was forced or unnatural, but in the same way he would speak to an old friend, someone he had known for years. It was a quiet companionship, the kind that didn't need words to be understood. And so Walter's kindness continued day by day without fanfare or ceremony. He didn't need anyone else to recognize what he was doing, because he knew. He knew that the dog was a part of his life now, and that was enough. In a world that often seemed too busy, too loud, and too quick to forget, Walter had found something that reminded him of the value of stillness, of kindness, and of the quiet moments that made life worth living. Walter's character. Walter Jensen was not the kind of man who wore his heart on his sleeve. He was a man of few words and even fewer gestures. In a world where grand displays of emotion, bold statements, and dramatic acts often defined a person, Walter was an anomaly. He was content in his quietness, in the simplicity of his actions. His life had been a steady rhythm of hard work, perseverance, and resilience, traits that had been molded over the years through both joys and losses. He had lived long enough to know that people didn't always value what was truly important, and that sometimes the quietest of hearts held the strongest convictions. Walter had built many things in his life: houses, friendships, and memories. He had also buried too many friends, watched too many neighbors grow old and pass away, and in the process learned a harsh lesson. Life was fleeting, and people, even the ones closest to you, could disappear in the blink of an eye. His wife Carol had been the love of his life. They had built a home together, raised their daughter, and made plans for a quiet retirement. But when Carol passed away, a piece of Walter's world went with her. He had been left with the house, the memories, and the routines they had shared, but the vibrant living presence of his wife was no longer there. Their daughter Emily had grown up and moved away as children do. She had her own life now, far from the small town of Maple Hollow, where Walter had lived most of his life. He didn't blame her for leaving. In fact, he understood. But the absence of her in his daily life left a void that was hard to
ignore. Walter had long since made peace with the fact that the world would keep moving forward, even when the people he loved most had moved on. He had learned to navigate the world on his own, in his own way, finding solace in his work and the quiet companionship of the few people who remained in his life. But Walter was not a man who believed in loud declarations of emotion. He wasn't the type to express his feelings with flowery words or showy acts of kindness. He didn't believe in doing things just to get attention or recognition. Instead, he had always preferred to lead by example, to show his care and compassion through actions, not words. His character was built on the quiet, often invisible things he did, things that no one would thank him for, but things that made a difference in the lives of those around him. Walter wasn't perfect. He had his flaws, his rough edges, and his regrets. But the one thing that could never be questioned about him was his integrity. He was a man who did what he thought was right, even when no one was watching. Even when there was no reward to be gained, no applause to be had. It was just the way he was. He believed in doing the work, no matter how thankless, and in showing kindness to others, even if they didn't ask for it. This was the man who, on that freezing January morning, had found the abandoned dog beneath the bus stop bench. While most people would have walked by, too caught up in their own lives or too afraid of getting involved, Walter had stopped. He had noticed the dog, noticed its trembling form, its lifeless eyes, and without a second thought, he had taken action. He had wrapped the dog in his scarf, lifted it in his arms, and carried it home. It was a small act, a quiet one, but for Walter, it was an expression of who he was, a man who saw what others overlooked, a man who acted when others hesitated. Walter didn't ask questions. He didn't need to know why the dog had been abandoned or who had left it there. He didn't need to know if the dog was sick or if it had been hurt. All that mattered to him was that the dog needed help, and Walter had always believed that when something needed help, you didn't wait for someone else to take action, you took it yourself. It wasn't about being a hero or seeking. He was a man who saw what others overlooked, a man who acted when others hesitated. Validation. It was about doing what was necessary, regardless of the recognition or the outcome. His decision to bring the dog into his home wasn't just an act of kindness, it was a reflection of Walter's character, of the man he had become over the years. He had been through too much in his life to waste time on trivial matters. He had learned that life was too short for regrets, too short for waiting around for someone else to do the right thing. If something needed doing, Walter would do it. If something needed caring for, Walter would care for it. It wasn't a decision he had to think about, it was just who he was. But Walter wasn't one to act on impulse alone. He had lived through enough pain, loss, and disappointment to understand the weight of responsibility. When he took the dog in, he didn't do it lightly. He knew that caring for the dog would require time, effort, and commitment. He knew that he was inviting something new into his life, something that would change his daily routine, his sense of solitude. But Walter didn't shy away from responsibility. In fact, he embraced it. He understood that life wasn't just about taking care of yourself, it was about taking care of others, whether they were human or animal. It was about being present, showing up, and doing what needed to be done, even when it wasn't easy. Walter Jensen wasn't the kind of man who needed to think about the right course of action for too long. His actions were often driven by instinct, shaped by years of experience, and informed by a quiet, unwavering sense of responsibility. The moment he spotted the dog under the bus stop bench, something deep within him stirred, and he knew exactly what needed to be done. There was no hesitation, no debate over whether or not it was the right thing to do. He didn't stop to question whether he had the time, the resources, or the energy to care for a dog, he simply acted. That was Walter's way. It wasn't the first time Walter had acted quickly when he saw something that needed fixing. In his life, he had built and repaired homes, fixed things that were broken, and often done things that others would shy away from simply because they required doing. Walter had learned early on that life didn't wait for the right moment to act, and that sometimes, doing something, anything, was better than standing still. And so, when he saw the dog, lying abandoned in the cold, trembling with fear and exhaustion, his immediate response was to act, without question, without delay. The dog's condition was alarming. It was obvious that it had been abandoned for quite some time, left to fend for itself in the freezing weather. The snow had soaked into its fur, and its body trembled violently with each breath. Its eyes, though wide and alert, were empty, like hollow pools of sadness. This wasn't just a stray dog, it was a creature who had been left behind, discarded in the cold like a piece of trash. Walter couldn't simply walk away. He couldn't turn his back on the animal in need. It wasn't just about the dog, it was about doing the right thing, the thing that anyone with a shred of empathy would do in that situation. As he walked back to his modest house, Walter's thoughts were not consumed with the questions that might have been on someone else's mind. He didn't wonder where the dog had come from or why it had been abandoned. He didn't speculate about its past or think about how it might have ended up in the situation it was in. Those questions would have to wait. Right now, the only thing that mattered was that the dog was suffering, and Walter had the ability to help. That was enough. When he arrived at his home, the familiar sight of his modest house felt like a small sanctuary in the midst of the cold, desolate world outside. Walter opened the door with his shoulder, careful not to jostle the dog too much in his arms. Inside, the warmth from the old wood stove wrapped around him like a comforting embrace, and he wasted no time. He laid the dog on a pile of blankets near the fire, where it could dry off and warm up. The room smelled faintly of wood smoke, a scent Walter had grown used to over the years, and he quickly prepared a bowl of warm broth, hoping it would help the dog regain some strength. Walter's actions were simple but deliberate. He didn't rush, but he didn't waste time either. There was no fanfare, no show of dramatic gestures. He simply did what needed to be done. He didn't need anyone to tell him what to do or offer him praise. He didn't need recognition or applause. For Walter, the satisfaction came not from the act itself but from knowing that he had done something good, something that mattered. The dog had been abandoned in the cold, and now it had a chance to recover, to find safety, warmth, and care. As the dog drank the warm broth, Walter watched it carefully, noting the way it hesitated at first before finally sipping the liquid. The animal was weak, its body shaking with the effort, but it was alive, and that was what mattered. Walter didn't rush the dog's recovery. He understood that it would take time. Healing, whether it was physical or emotional, didn't happen overnight. It took patience, care, and, most importantly, consistency. Later, as the evening drew on and the fire crackled in the stove, Walter sat down in his favorite armchair, the one by the window where he could watch the snow fall outside. He looked over at the dog, now curled on the blankets, its breathing steady, the tremors of fear and cold slowly fading away. For the first time in days, the house felt alive with warmth and presence, not just from the fire, but from the quiet companionship of the dog. Walter didn't know yet if the dog would stay. He hadn't named it, after all, but he felt something stir inside him, a small sense of connection that he hadn't expected. Maybe it was the way the dog had looked up at him with those tired eyes, or the way it had accepted the warmth he had offered without hesitation. Whatever it was, it gave Walter a feeling he hadn't realized he was missing. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel so alone. Walter's actions in the following days reflected the same quiet determination. He didn't overthink things or try to force a connection with the dog. Instead, he simply did what needed to be done. He fed the dog, kept it warm, and made sure it was comfortable. He didn't rush to fix it, to change it, or to impose his own expectations on the dog's recovery. He just allowed things to unfold naturally, trusting in the process of healing. As the dog began to regain its strength, Walter noticed the small changes that indicated it was starting to trust him. At first, the dog had stayed curled up in the corner, keeping to itself, too afraid to come closer. But over time, it began to follow Walter around the house, its steps tentative at first, but growing more confident as it realized that it was safe here. The dog no longer flinched at every movement or sound, and it began to rest more comfortably in its new surroundings. Walter had given the dog something it had never had before: consistency, care, and a sense of security, and in return, the dog had begun to trust him. Walter didn't make a big deal of it. He didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. He had done what needed to be done, and now the dog was slowly coming back to life. It wasn't a dramatic, heroic story, but it was enough for Walter. He didn't need anything more. There were no grand declarations, no speeches about the importance of kindness. There was no applause, no recognition. Walter didn't want any of that. For him, the satisfaction came from the small, quiet things, the things that most people never noticed but that made all the difference in the world. Helping a dog that had been abandoned, offering it warmth and comfort in its time of need, wasn't something to brag about. It was simply what needed to be done. And that, in Walter's eyes, was enough. The first night the dog spent in Walter's house was one of quiet, tentative peace. The fire crackled softly in the wood stove, the only sound in the room besides the gentle rustle of the dog's breathing as it lay curled up on the pile of blankets Walter had arranged by the fire. The warmth from the stove filled the room, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the dog was safe, sheltered from the cruel, biting cold of the winter outside. Walter sat in his favorite armchair by the window, a cup of tea in hand, staring out at the falling snow. The world outside seemed to be holding its breath, wrapped in a blanket of white silence. Inside the house, however, the stillness felt different. It was a quiet that was comforting, one that was infused with the promise of something new, something that had yet to fully unfold. He had been alone for so long that the presence of the dog, even in its weakened state, felt like a welcome disruption to the silence he had grown so accustomed to. There was life in the house again, even if it was just a small dog, and that small change made all the difference. The dog had settled by the fire without protest, its body still trembling from the cold, but no longer with the violent shakes of desperation it had shown earlier. Its eyes, once hollow and full of abandonment, now held a soft vulnerability, as though it was unsure whether to trust this sudden change in its fortune. Walter noticed the way it hesitated before closing its eyes, as if afraid to drift off into sleep for fear of waking up alone in the cold once more. But slowly, over the course of the evening, the dog seemed to relax, its body gradually releasing the tension that had held it so rigid just hours before. Walter watched it for a long time, not knowing what to expect. He had always been a man of action, not words, and while he had taken the dog in with no expectation, he still found himself wondering what would happen next. Would the dog stay? Would it learn to trust him, to see him as something more than a temporary refuge from the cold? Or would it keep its distance, maintaining its wariness as a shield against the unknown? The dog didn't move much, save for the occasional shift in its sleep, the gentle rise and fall of its chest as it took in each breath. There was something peaceful about it, despite its frailty. Walter didn't disturb it. He simply let the dog rest, understanding that it needed time to adjust. He had spent enough of his own life in the quiet solitude of his home to know that peace couldn't be rushed. It was something that came in its own time, after a period of stillness, of letting go. And the dog, Walter realized, was in need of that stillness just as much as he was. He got up once to check on the dog, his footsteps quiet on the floor as he moved toward the blankets. The dog's eyes flicked open at the sound, but it didn't retreat or show signs of fear. Instead, it blinked slowly, as though acknowledging Walter's presence without a need for words. Walter reached out gently, running his hand over the dog's fur. It was still matted in places, its coat rough and patchy from neglect, but under the layers of dirt and snow, Walter could feel the faint warmth returning to its body. The dog was alive, and that was all that mattered. Walter didn't know if the dog had ever known a life of comfort, a life where food was plentiful and warmth was guaranteed. It didn't matter now. What mattered was that it had a chance to start over. He hadn't brought the dog into his home for any grand reason, other than the simple fact that it had needed him, and Walter wasn't the type to turn away from a creature in need. He had spent too many years working with his hands, building and fixing things, to ignore something that was broken. And the dog, as fragile as it seemed, wasn't beyond repair. Not yet. As the night wore on, the fire in the stove began to burn low, the crackling noises slowing down to a soft, steady hum. Walter moved to add more wood to the stove, the familiar motion grounding him, reminding him of the years he had spent taking care of his home, of the small rituals that kept his world in balance. He glanced over at the dog once more, noting the way it had shifted, now lying with its head resting gently on the blankets, the tension finally leaving its body. The dog was sleeping soundly, its breathing slow and steady, no longer ragged with the fear that had once gripped it. Walter let out a quiet sigh, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. There was something deeply satisfying about the sight of the dog, now at peace, resting comfortably in a place where it could heal. The room felt warmer somehow, even though the fire wasn't as bright as it had been earlier. It wasn't just the physical warmth from the stove, it was the warmth of something more profound, the warmth of companionship, even if it was just the quiet presence of a dog. It was a kind of connection that Walter hadn't realized he had been missing. As the hours passed and the night deepened, Walter remained in his chair, watching the dog, letting the silence of the house envelop him. There were no words spoken, no need for words. The dog's presence was enough. It had been a long time since Walter had felt like this, like someone, or something, needed him in the same way he needed it. It was a quiet companionship, one that didn't demand anything, yet gave more than Walter had expected. In the stillness of the night, Walter found himself thinking about the choices he had made in his life. He had spent years building homes, fixing things that were broken, and looking after what needed to be cared for. But now, with this dog lying at his feet, Walter realized that sometimes the things we fix aren't just physical things. Sometimes, the brokenness we heal isn't just in houses or objects, it's in the hearts of those who need it. And as he looked down at the dog, now resting peacefully by the fire, Walter understood that he wasn't just caring for an animal. He was caring for something that had been abandoned, something that had been discarded without a second thought. He wasn't just repairing a broken creature, he was giving it something it had never had before, belonging. And so, as the dog's first night in Walter's home passed quietly, Walter remained by the fire, allowing the dog to rest, to heal, and to find comfort. There were no expectations, no rush for things to change. Everything would happen in its own time, in its own way. Walter had learned that in his life, and now, he was learning it again. Healing took time, and so did trust. But for now, the dog was safe, and that was enough. As Walter sat quietly in his living room, the dog now soundly asleep on the blankets near the fire, he found his gaze drifting to the leather collar he had removed from the animal earlier. It was lying on the kitchen counter, still with traces of dirt and snow on it. Walter hadn't paid much attention to it in the rush of bringing the dog inside and making sure it was comfortable. He had only thought of it as a simple collar, something that belonged to the dog, nothing more. But now, with the room still and quiet, a curiosity began to stir in him. He slowly got up from his chair and walked over to the counter where the collar lay. He picked it up gently, turning it over in his hands, feeling the smoothness of the leather and the weight of the brass buckle. It was a well-made collar, too well made to be the typical kind one would find on a stray. The stitching was perfect, the leather soft but strong, and the brass tag, which had once been secured to the collar, gleamed even in the dim light of the room. There was something distinctly expensive about it, something that didn't quite match the rough, desperate state the dog had been in when Walter found it. Walter's fingers traced the edges of the collar, and that was when he saw it, the monogram. It was small but unmistakable, a delicate, C, embossed in elegant, cursive letters, the kind of monogram that was often reserved for high-end, custom-made goods. Walter's heart sank slightly as he stared at the letters. This was no ordinary collar. This wasn't the kind of collar you'd find on a dog that had been abandoned in the snow, left to die without care. No, this collar had been carefully chosen, crafted with care, and affixed to a dog that, at one point, had clearly been loved, or at least, cared for by someone with means. Walter's mind began to race, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place one by one. This dog, this poor creature he had found abandoned in the cold, had once belonged to someone with wealth. Someone who could afford such a collar, someone who likely had the means to care for the dog, to give it a comfortable life. And yet, this same person had decided to discard the dog like a broken toy when it no longer suited their needs. The realization was unsettling. It spoke to a cruelty that was hard to understand, a cruelty that didn't come from a lack of resources, but from a complete absence of empathy. Walter set the collar down on the counter and walked over to the dog. He knelt beside it, carefully observing the animal's still form. It had grown quieter since its first arrival at his house, no longer trembling as it had in those first few moments. Its breathing had slowed, and its body seemed to be absorbing the warmth of the room, recovering from the shock of its ordeal. Walter reached down and ran his hand gently through the dog's fur, feeling the softness of it under his fingers. But it wasn't just the dog's fur that he was thinking about now. His mind kept drifting back to the collar, to the monogram, to the realization that this dog had once been part of someone's life. The more Walter thought about it, the more the details became clear. This wasn't just a stray that had wandered off and gotten lost. This was a dog that had been intentionally abandoned. The collar wasn't something you bought at a pet store, it was something custom-made, something that spoke of wealth, of class, of status. Walter had seen enough of the world to know that this wasn't a collar that belonged to a dog who had been left to roam the streets. This collar had been worn by a dog who had once had a home, a home that had now been lost. Walter felt a surge of anger rise in him, but it wasn't just anger at the person who had abandoned the dog. It was a deep, gnawing frustration, a sense of helplessness at the thought that someone could be so callous, so heartless. This dog, who had once been cared for, who had once worn a collar with a beautiful monogram, had been left in the snow to freeze. It didn't make sense. Walter couldn't wrap his mind around how someone could treat an animal this way, could leave it behind like it was nothing more than a disposable object. He stood up slowly, his hand still resting on the dog's fur, as he tried to make sense of it. The dog's gentle rise and fall of its chest was the only thing that anchored him to the present moment. There was no answer to the questions swirling in his mind, at least, not yet. But Walter was determined to find out more. The monogram was a clue, something that pointed to a specific person or a specific place. It was too deliberate, too carefully crafted to be meaningless. Walter had worked with his hands all his life, and he knew when something was made with intention. The collar wasn't just a collar, it was a statement, a piece of someone's life that had been carelessly discarded. That night, Walter couldn't sleep. He kept returning to the collar, to the "C" that was etched so delicately into the leather. He tried to push it from his mind, but it wouldn't go. It gnawed at him, like a persistent itch he couldn't reach. The dog had no name, no past that Walter knew of, but the collar spoke volumes. And somehow, he knew that it was only the beginning of a story that would soon unfold in a way he wasn't prepared for. The next morning, after the dog had eaten and rested, Walter went to the kitchen and took the collar with him. He examined it more closely, taking note of the craftsmanship, the fine stitching, the custom brass buckle, and the delicate monogram that seemed almost out of place on a dog who had been abandoned so carelessly. There was a certain elegance to it that spoke of wealth and status, of someone who could afford the finest things in life. And yet, that same person had decided that this dog, this living, breathing creature, was no longer worth their time. Walter knew that he couldn't ignore it. He had to find out who the dog had belonged to, and why it had been abandoned in such a cold, heartless way. The collar wasn't just a piece of leather, it was a clue, and Walter had spent too many years working with his hands, fixing things, solving problems, to let something like this go unanswered. He couldn't just let the dog's past remain a mystery. He couldn't just turn a blind eye to the cruelty that had been shown to it. No, Walter would find out who had left this dog behind, and when he did, he would make sure that person understood what abandonment felt like. With the collar in his hand, Walter set out to uncover the truth. He didn't know where it would lead him or how deep the story would go, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let the dog's past remain a forgotten secret. The collar had a story to tell, and Walter was determined to listen. The days following Walter's discovery of the dog's collar were filled with a quiet, unspoken tension. As the dog continued to heal, becoming stronger and more accustomed to its new surroundings, Walter found himself reflecting on the strange turn his life had taken. It had started with a simple act of kindness, picking up a trembling, abandoned dog from the snow, but now, as the days wore on, it seemed to be unraveling a deeper story, one that Walter hadn't anticipated. Sitting in his chair by the fire one evening, Walter gazed down at the dog, now resting comfortably at his feet, its fur glossy and its breathing steady. The warmth of the room, combined with the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of the dog's chest, created a sense of peace in the room, a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts swirling inside Walter's mind. He had taken in this dog without thinking twice about it, but now, as he watched it sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the situation than he had first realized. The monogrammed collar had been a catalyst for these thoughts. As Walter turned it over and over in his hands, he couldn't help but wonder how someone who had been able to afford such an elegant, custom-made collar could have abandoned this creature so carelessly. The thought gnawed at him, digging into his heart like a thorn he couldn't remove. He had spent much of his life building houses, mending broken things, and helping others, but this was different. This wasn't just about fixing a physical object, this was about a life that had been cast aside. And, in many ways, it felt like a betrayal, not just of the dog, but of everything Walter had come to value in his quiet, solitary existence. He had never been one to think too much about the motivations of others, preferring to focus on the things that he could control, the work in front of him, the people around him, the simple pleasures of life. He had learned early on that some things in life were beyond explanation, and that often, it was best to let things unfold on their own. But this dog, this small, trembling creature that had been left to freeze in the cold, did not fit into the life Walter had come to accept. It called into question the very fabric of his world, forcing him to confront a harsh truth he had never wanted to face. Cruelty existed in places Walter had never expected to find it. It wasn't just the poor or the forgotten who were capable of cruelty. Even those who had everything, money, power, status, could be just as heartless. Walter leaned back in his chair, his fingers tracing the collar once more. The dog had been abandoned in the snow, left to die in a place where no one would notice. But Walter had noticed. And in doing so, he had begun to question everything he had known about the world around him. The collar wasn't just an accessory, it was a symbol of something deeper. It was a mark of wealth, yes, but it was also a mark of indifference. Whoever had left this dog behind had shown no more regard for its life than one would show for a piece of discarded furniture. And that thought, more than anything else, bothered Walter. It wasn't just the physical act of abandonment, it was the emotional and moral void behind it. How could someone look into the eyes of a creature so loyal, so trusting, and simply walk away? As he sat there, lost in thought, the dog stirred, raising its head to look up at him with those tired, soulful eyes. Walter met its gaze, and for a moment, the world outside the room seemed to fade away. It was as though the dog, despite everything it had been through, understood. It wasn't just looking at Walter, it was looking into him, reading the quiet struggle that had been brewing in his heart ever since he had found it. There was something in its gaze, a quiet knowing, as if it too understood the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about the bond they had formed, the unspoken agreement that Walter would care for it, and in return, the dog would offer something in return, though neither of them knew what that was just yet. Walter sighed softly, his reflection deepening. He had always prided himself on his ability to live a quiet, content life, free from the drama and chaos that often plagued others. He had built his life on simplicity, on the small things that mattered, the warmth of a fire on a cold night, the satisfaction of a job well done, the companionship of a few close friends. But the dog, this small, broken creature, was challenging all of that. It was forcing him to confront things he had long avoided, his own loneliness, the fragility of life, and the unsettling reality that, sometimes, things could be discarded without a second thought. But what troubled him most was the realization that, in a way, the dog wasn't the only one who had been discarded. Walter's own life, his own heart, had been buried beneath years of routine and solitude. He had become so used to being alone, so comfortable in his quiet, predictable world, that he had forgotten how to reach out to others. He had forgotten the warmth of connection, the joy of companionship, the way it felt to care for someone, or something, in a way that was truly meaningful. The dog's abandonment had forced Walter to reckon with his own sense of abandonment, with the parts of himself he had locked away, convinced that they were no longer needed. Walter had lost a lot in his life, his wife, his friends, the dreams he and Carol had once shared. But he had always managed to keep going, to keep moving forward. He had found solace in his work, in the routine of everyday life. But the dog had changed that. It had brought something new into his world, something that could no longer be ignored. The dog needed him, but in some strange way, Walter realized that he needed the dog too. Not just for the companionship it offered, but for the way it was forcing him to rediscover parts of himself that had been buried for far too long. He couldn't just go back to his old life. The silence that had once been his companion now felt heavy, oppressive. The dog had reminded him of something he had forgotten, something he had pushed aside in his efforts to protect himself from the pain of loss. He had hidden behind the walls he had built, convinced that solitude was the safest choice. But now, with the dog lying at his feet, Walter realized that there was a life outside those walls, a life that was messy, unpredictable, and full of both joy and sorrow. The dog was a reminder that life didn't wait for you to be ready, it just happened, and sometimes, you had to open yourself up to it, no matter how frightening it seemed. As Walter sat there, his thoughts swirling, the dog shifted again, curling its body a little closer to him. It was a subtle movement, but it spoke volumes. The dog trusted him now, in a way that was both humbling and profound. It had given itself to Walter, offering its trust without hesitation, despite everything it had endured. And in that quiet, unspoken exchange, Walter understood that this was what it meant to truly care for something, to truly give of yourself. It wasn't about what you could get in return, it was about being present, being there when it mattered most. Walter leaned down and gently stroked the dog's fur, the act simple but filled with meaning. As his fingers traced the dog's body, he thought about the journey they had both begun, a journey that had started with a simple act of kindness but was quickly becoming something more. The dog had been abandoned, but so too had Walter abandoned parts of himself. But now, they were both here, together, in this quiet house, finding their way back to something they had both lost. And for the first time in a long while, Walter felt a sense of hope, a glimmer of something that told him that even in the face of abandonment, there was still the possibility of healing. As the days passed and the winter slowly began to retreat, Walter found himself growing more accustomed to the presence of the dog in his life. What had started as an impulsive act of kindness, a simple decision to rescue an abandoned animal from the cold, had quietly evolved into something much deeper. The dog, which had once been nothing more than a trembling, fearful creature, now seemed to be settling into its new life with Walter in a way that was almost imperceptible, but no less real. And with that transformation, Walter's own heart began to soften in ways he hadn't anticipated. Walter had never been one to form attachments easily. He had lived most of his life in solitude, built walls around his heart to protect it from the pain of loss. He had lost his wife, Carol, many years ago, and after her death, he had retreated further into his work and his routines. The years had passed in a blur of carpentry, repairs, and the quiet hum of his small, lived-in home. He had been content with this life of quiet, predictable solitude, where the rhythms of the seasons and the hum of the stove provided all the company he needed. But then, the dog had come into his life, and everything had changed. At first, Walter had been cautious, reluctant to form any deep emotional connection with the animal. He hadn't even named it, unwilling to acknowledge that this dog might be more than a temporary companion. He had told himself that it was just a matter of providing the dog with what it needed, food, warmth, and shelter, until it was well enough to return to the world outside. He had even convinced himself that he wasn't looking for anything more than that he wasn't trying to replace the companionship he had lost when Carol passed. But as the days wore on, Walter realized that he was no longer just caring for a sick dog. He was starting to care for the dog in a way that was unfamiliar to him, deeply, quietly, and without even realizing it. It wasn't that Walter had consciously set out to form this attachment. It wasn't something he had planned or thought about. It just happened. One morning, as Walter watched the dog struggle to get up from its blankets, its body still weak from its time on the streets, Walter found himself bending down to offer a hand to steady it. The dog looked up at him, its eyes filled with gratitude, as if it knew exactly what Walter was doing, and without thinking, Walter spoke to it softly, a kind of reassurance that felt natural. "Take it slow," he murmured, "you've been through a lot." And as the dog carefully stood, Walter noticed something in himself, a shift, a softening of the walls he had built around his heart. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something else, something more vulnerable, something that reached deeper than he had ever allowed himself to feel. The dog, in turn, seemed to sense this shift. Over the following days, it grew more comfortable in Walter's presence, no longer shrinking away from him or showing signs of fear when he approached. It began to follow him around the house, not with the frantic, anxious steps of an animal that feared abandonment, but with a quiet, steady presence that seemed to say, "I trust you." It wasn't always obvious at first. There were still moments when the dog would retreat into the corner, or when its eyes would flicker with uncertainty, but those moments grew fewer and farther between as the days passed. Walter's attachment to the dog wasn't immediate. It wasn't as if he woke up one morning and suddenly realized that he had become emotionally invested. It was a gradual process, one that unfolded slowly, like the thawing of the snow outside, until one day, Walter realized that he couldn't imagine his life without the dog. He began to talk to it more often, not in baby talk, but in the same way he had once spoken to Carol when they had sat together by the fire, sharing stories and memories of their life together. He would talk about the weather, about the neighbors, about the projects he was working on around the house. The dog didn't respond with words, of course, but it would tilt its head slightly, blink slowly, or rest its chin on Walter's boot as if to say, "I'm listening." And for Walter, that was enough. It was strange for him, this growing attachment. He had never been one to form deep emotional bonds with anyone or anything. The loss of Carol had left a hole in his life that he had never truly addressed. He had learned to live with that emptiness, to fill it with the steady work of his hands and the quiet solitude of his home. But now, with the dog in his life, he found himself confronting that emptiness in a way he hadn't anticipated. The dog wasn't a replacement for Carol, and Walter knew that. But the dog filled something inside him, something that had been missing for a long time. It was a companionship that didn't require anything in return, a relationship built on trust and presence, not expectation or obligation. As the days passed and the snow continued to melt outside, Walter's life began to change in subtle ways. He found himself looking forward to his mornings with the dog, to the quiet companionship of their routine. He would take the dog on walks through the woods, the dog now strong enough to keep up with him, its limp from the malnutrition of its past slowly fading away. He found himself speaking to it more, not in a way that demanded a response, but in a way that filled the silence with something more meaningful. He began to feel a sense of joy in these small moments, a joy that had been absent from his life for so long. And through all of this, Walter realized something important. The dog had come into his life when he had least expected it, and in doing so, it had helped him realize that he wasn't as alone as he had thought. It wasn't just the dog that needed him, it was Walter who needed the dog. The companionship, the trust, the quiet bond that had formed between them was something that Walter hadn't realized he had been missing. And in that realization, he understood that sometimes, the things we need most in life are the things we least expect. As Walter continued to care for the dog, he found himself opening up in ways he hadn't allowed himself to before. He was no longer living in a world of quiet resignation, where solitude was his only companion. He was learning that connection, even in its simplest form, could heal wounds that had long been buried. The dog had given him a gift, one that wasn't measured in grand gestures or flashy displays of affection, but in the small, everyday moments of trust and presence. And for the first time in a long time, Walter realized that he wasn't just caring for the dog. The dog, in its own quiet way, was caring for him too. The morning after Walter had noticed the subtle but steady signs of the dog's improvement, he couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. The dog, once a fragile and shivering bundle of bones and fur, now had a stronger presence in the house. Its breathing was no longer shallow with weakness, and its movements had become more assured. Walter had done his part, he had given the dog warmth, comfort, and food, but now, as he watched it settle in front of the fire, he felt the nagging urge to know more, to take further steps in its recovery. He had become attached to the dog in ways he hadn't fully realized, and now he felt an odd sense of responsibility, a desire to do whatever he could to ensure it would be all right. For the first time since taking the dog in, Walter decided to measure its progress more systematically. He knew the dog had gained some weight, that its coat was growing shinier, and that its eyes no longer carried the same hollow, haunted look they had the first time he saw it. But Walter had spent too many years in the world of carpentry, fixing things that needed repair, to rely on mere observation alone. He had a need to understand things more deeply, to gauge just how far the dog had come and how much farther it might need to go. It wasn't enough to simply guess, he needed to know the full picture. That's when it occurred to him. He hadn't used the old veterinary scale in years, but it was still there, tucked away in the shed at the back of the house. It had been a relic from his younger days when he had volunteered at the animal shelter for a brief time. It was an old, sturdy scale, the kind used to weigh larger animals, and even though it had been gathering dust for years, Walter knew it would give him the information he needed. It wasn't just curiosity, it was part of his nature to be thorough, to ensure that the job was done properly, no matter how small the task. The morning was quiet, save for the soft crackling of the fire in the stove and the rhythmic sound of the dog's breathing. Walter made up his mind, and with a purposeful stride, he got to his feet, walking toward the shed. He was careful not to disturb the dog, who had already nestled itself back down on the blankets near the fire. He knew the dog would be safe for a while, resting comfortably in the warmth of the house. The shed was a short walk from the main house, tucked behind the back door, and though Walter had not used the scale in many years, he knew exactly where it was. The shed smelled of sawdust and old tools, a scent that always brought a sense of calm to Walter. It was familiar, a reminder of the days when he had worked alongside his wife, Carol, in the yard, fixing up their property and dreaming of the future. But those days were long gone. The scale, now covered in a thin layer of dust, was tucked away in the corner next to the stack of old lumber. Walter cleared away some of the clutter and carefully lifted the scale, bringing it into the main room where he had set up a temporary space for the dog. The process of weighing the dog felt oddly ceremonial to Walter. He wasn't sure why. After all, it was just a routine step in the dog's recovery, a practical task. But something about it felt significant, almost as if it marked a turning point, not just in the dog's healing process but in Walter's own journey. The dog had become more than just an animal to care for, it had become a symbol of something deeper, a way for Walter to reflect on the choices he had made and the life he had built for himself. As he set the scale down on the floor, Walter took a moment to prepare the dog. He gently lifted it from its blankets and placed it carefully on the scale. The dog was light in his hands, but Walter had already noticed that its body seemed to be gaining strength, its form filling out a little more each day. But the reality of the dog's fragility was still present, and as he set it down on the scale, Walter couldn't help but notice the sharpness of the bones beneath the fur, the thinness of its frame. It was clear that the dog had been through a lot, that it had been deprived of what it needed for far too long. The scale's needle flicked briefly before settling on the number. Walter glanced at it closely, noting the weight that blinked back at him. His brow furrowed slightly. The dog weighed much less than it should have, almost 10 pounds below what would have been normal for its size and breed. The reality of the dog's condition hit him like a punch to the stomach. It wasn't just the cold that had affected the dog, it had been malnourished, underfed, and likely neglected for a long time before Walter had found it. The dog's body had been weakened not only by the elements but by the absence of proper care. Walter sighed quietly, his mind racing. He had known the dog was underweight, but seeing the number on the scale made it feel more real, more urgent. This was more than just a dog that had been abandoned, it was a dog that had suffered, a dog that had been treated like an object, tossed aside when it no longer served its purpose. Walter's eyes hardened as he looked at the dog, who now seemed to be gazing up at him with a quiet, trusting expression. The dog didn't know the extent of its own suffering, but Walter did, and that knowledge fueled something in him, a resolve that he hadn't even known he had. He lifted the dog gently off the scale and carried it back to its blankets by the fire. The dog didn't resist, its body still weak but slowly growing stronger. Walter set it down softly, rubbing its head gently as he tried to process the information. He had known that the dog had been through a lot, but seeing the stark reality of its malnutrition made it clear that there was much more work to be done. Walter wasn't the type to sit idly by, waiting for things to improve on their own. He had always been someone who believed in action, who believed that if you wanted to change something, you had to put in the effort. And now, more than ever, he knew that the dog's recovery would require care, patience, and a steady hand. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks along the way, and the road to full recovery would be long. But Walter wasn't afraid of that. He had spent too many years fixing things, building things, to turn away from a challenge now. The dog's recovery wasn't just about feeding it or providing it with warmth, it was about restoring its strength, both physically and emotionally. The malnourishment and weakness would take time to reverse, but with each day, Walter knew the dog would become stronger. It had already shown incredible resilience, and Walter had no doubt that, with the right care, the dog would regain its health and vitality. For Walter, this wasn't just a matter of healing the dog's body, it was about healing something deeper, something that had been broken both in the dog and in himself. The dog had come to him at a time when he had felt disconnected, when he had retreated so far into his own life that he had almost forgotten what it meant to care for something with a deep, unconditional love. The dog was teaching him that it was never too late to rebuild, to heal, and to open your heart again. He had known that the dog had been through a lot, but seeing the stark reality of its malnutrition made it clear that there was much more work to be done. Walter wasn't the type to sit idly by, waiting for things to improve on their own. He had always been someone who believed in action, who believed that if you wanted to change something, you had to put in the effort, and now, more than ever, he can. And now, more than ever, he knew that the dog's recovery would require care, patience, and a steady hand. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks along the way, and the road to full recovery would be long. But Walter wasn't afraid of that. He had spent too many years fixing things, building things, to turn away from a challenge now. The dog's recovery wasn't just about feeding it or providing it with warmth, it was about restoring its strength, both physically and emotionally. The malnourishment and weakness would take time to reverse, but with each day, Walter knew the dog would become stronger. It had already shown incredible resilience, and Walter had no doubt that, with the right care, the dog would regain its health and vitality. For Walter, this wasn't just a matter of healing the dog's body, it was about healing something deeper, something that had been broken both in the dog and in himself. The dog had come to him at a time when he had felt disconnected, when he had retreated so far into his own life that he had almost forgotten what it meant to care for something with a deep, unconditional love. The dog was teaching him that it was never too late to rebuild, to heal, and to open your heart again. But it wasn't just about the practical tasks, it was about the quiet moments, the soft companionship that had begun to take root between them. And in those moments, Walter found himself realizing that this was not just a dog he had taken in, this was a companion, a reminder of the things he had long forgotten. The weight on the scale had shown him the reality of the dog's condition, but it had also shown him something else, that there was still time, still a chance to heal, to restore, and to make things right. And Walter was more than willing to give it that chance. The day Walter received the letter, the weather had shifted dramatically. The skies, which had been a dull, overcast gray for most of the morning, had cleared to a crisp blue, with the sunlight casting long shadows across the yard. It felt like a quiet victory, a small reprieve from the relentless cold of winter. Walter had spent the early part of the day taking care of the dog, whose health was improving steadily, and had managed to finish repairing the back fence that had been leaning precariously for weeks. The feeling of accomplishment, however small, was something Walter had come to cherish. It was familiar. It was something he could hold on to. As Walter went inside to warm up with a cup of tea, he saw the envelope resting on his kitchen counter. It had been placed there so deliberately, with no sign of a stamp or return address, as if someone had simply slid it through the crack in the door. Walter frowned slightly, his instincts immediately kicking in. There was something odd about this letter, something that felt out of place. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and the paper was of an unusual texture, heavy and finely made, not the kind you typically found in a mailbox. He turned it over slowly in his hands, his fingers brushing the smooth surface of the paper, looking for any clue as to who it might be from. There was no name, no return address, no markings at all. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere. A small shiver ran through Walter as he carefully broke the seal on the envelope, his mind racing with possibilities. He had lived a quiet, solitary life, one that didn't invite mystery or intrigue. He wasn't accustomed to receiving personal letters, especially ones that came without any clear sender. With the dog's recovery taking up much of his attention, he hadn't thought much about the outside world, and it seemed odd that something, or someone, would intrude on his peaceful existence now. Walter pulled the letter from the envelope, unfolding it carefully, as though it held something far more important than mere words. As he read, his brow furrowed deeper with each line. The message inside was brief but direct. Underscore 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 underscore. If you found the dog, you can keep him. He is no longer useful to us. Do not attempt to return him. See Hara. Underscore 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 underscore. Underscore 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 underscore. The words hit Walter with an unexpected force. His fingers tightened around the letter as his mind tried to process what he had just read. The words were cold, almost mechanical in their delivery, and there was an undeniable finality to them that sent a chill running down his spine. He stood there, staring at the letter for several moments, unable to make sense of it. The first thing that struck Walter was the sheer cruelty of it. The dog, this fragile, trusting creature that he had rescued from the snow, had clearly once belonged to someone with wealth and privilege. The collar, the elegant monogram, all of it had pointed to that fact. But this letter stripped away any illusion that the dog had been anything other than a disposable commodity, something to be discarded when it was no longer useful. Who was Hara? And why would someone write a letter like this, so cold and indifferent, as if a living creature could be so easily dismissed? Walter had seen cruelty in his life, but this was something else, a cruelty wrapped in wealth and power, a detachment that Walter couldn't quite fathom. It was as though the dog, despite the bond they had started to form, was still nothing more than an object, a possession to be discarded when it no longer served its purpose. Walter's hand tightened around the letter as he turned it over, looking for anything he might have missed, some kind of clue, a signature, anything that could help him understand who had written this. But there was nothing. Just the stark message and the name, Hara, which meant nothing to Walter. He couldn't ignore the feeling of dread that began to settle in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This letter suggested a far deeper problem, one that Walter couldn't fully comprehend. Whoever had written it had made it clear that they didn't want the dog back, that it was no longer their concern. But that wasn't what unsettled Walter the most. What troubled him was the coldness of the words, the impersonal tone that made it seem like the dog had simply outlived its usefulness. It was as if the dog's life had no value, and Walter couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play here. For the first time since finding the dog, Walter began to feel a sense of urgency, a need to understand the full story behind this abandoned creature. This wasn't just about a stray dog that needed a home, it was about something deeper, something darker that Walter couldn't yet see. Whoever had left the dog in the snow and written this letter had done so with purpose, and Walter was determined to find out what that purpose was. He folded the letter carefully and placed it on the kitchen table, his mind spinning with questions. Who was Hara? Why had they sent this letter, and what did it mean? Walter's thoughts immediately turned to the monogram on the collar, the C that had once marked the dogs belonging to someone. Could Hara be connected to that monogram? Could they be the same person who had abandoned the dog, someone who had once cared for it but now saw it as nothing more than a burden? Walter knew that he couldn't just sit idly by and let this go unanswered. The dog was no longer just a stray, it was part of a larger story, one that had yet to unfold. And Walter had never been one to let things go unexplored. He was a man of action, a man who believed that when something needed to be done, it had to be done without hesitation. And so, with the letter still weighing heavily in his hand, Walter made up his mind. He would find out who Hara was, and he would learn the truth behind the dog's abandonment. His first instinct was to go straight to the authorities, to turn over the letter and ask for help. But something held him back. Walter didn't trust the authorities, not in a situation like this. This wasn't just about an abandoned dog, it was about something deeper, something that involved people with power and money, people who could easily make things disappear with the right resources. Walter wasn't naive. He knew how the world worked, and he knew that if he wanted to get to the bottom of this, he would have to do it on his own. The first step, he decided, was to find out more about Hara and the possible connection to the collar. He wasn't sure where to start, but he knew that the monogram on the collar was the key. There had to be a reason someone with so much money had gone to such lengths to make sure the collar was unique, custom-made. It wasn't something you just picked up at a pet store. Walter had a feeling that finding out where the collar had come from would lead him to the answers he needed. But for now, all he had was the letter, the name Hara, and a growing sense of unease. Whatever was going on, Walter knew that it was far from over. And as he looked down at the dog, now lying peacefully at his feet, he understood that this wasn't just about caring for an animal, it was about standing up for what was right, about giving a voice to the silent victims of cruelty. And Walter Jensen was ready to do just that. Walter had always considered himself a man of patience. He had built his life on the steady, deliberate rhythms of hard work, carefully cutting wood, measuring precisely, hammering nails into place with practiced hands. His world had been one of quiet, thoughtful actions, a life built over years, brick by brick, without the rush or hurry that defined others. But the moment the letter had landed on his kitchen counter, a subtle shift had occurred within him. The letter was a jolt, an unexpected disruption to his carefully curated solitude, and as the words on the page sank in, Walter realized something important. Patience had its place, but there were moments in life that demanded more. Some things couldn't be allowed to pass quietly by, and this dog, this letter, was one of those moments. Walter sat at the kitchen table, the letter still lying in front of him. The weight of it, both literally and figuratively, hung heavy in the air. He had read it over and over, each time feeling a new layer of anger, confusion, and determination rising within him. If you found the dog, you can keep him. He is no longer useful to us. Do not attempt to return him. See Hara. The words were cruel, indifferent, and written with a chilling sense of finality, as if the dog's life were nothing more than a commodity, an object to be discarded when it no longer served a purpose. And yet, the more Walter thought about it, the more something inside him refused to let it go. He couldn't, in good conscience, let this letter be the end of the story. Not when he knew that there was so much more to uncover. Walter wasn't a man who acted on impulse. He didn't rush into situations without thinking them through. But this was different. This wasn't just about caring for a dog, it was about standing up for what was right, about confronting a cruelty that Walter couldn't allow to go unchallenged. The dog had been abandoned, yes, but it was the coldness with which it had been cast aside that gnawed at him the most. How could someone be so heartless? How could they simply leave a creature to die in the cold, with no care for its well-being, no regard for its life? This wasn't just a stray that had gotten lost, this was an animal that had been purposefully discarded, as if its life had no value. Walter's determination grew as the weight of the situation settled in his chest. He had always prided himself on doing what was right, on being a man of integrity. But the more he thought about the letter, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about a simple act of kindness toward an animal. It was about standing up to something larger, something that went beyond the immediate situation. It was about taking responsibility for something that had been left in the cold, literally and figuratively, and refusing to let it slip quietly into the shadows. Walter stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as he moved toward the counter. He picked up the letter again, reading it one last time. "See Hara," the letter had said, as though that was some sort of instruction that would make everything clear. Walter had no idea who Hara was, but he was determined to find out. He knew that the dog's past, its abandonment, was linked to someone with power, someone who had made the decision to throw it away as if it meant nothing. But Walter wasn't going to let them get away with it. He couldn't. The first step, he knew, was to find out more about the collar. That monogram, C, had to mean something. It was too distinctive, too deliberate, to be ignored. Walter wasn't the type to just sit back and wait for answers to come to him. He had spent his whole life fixing things, finding solutions, and he wasn't about to let a mystery like this go unsolved. If there was a trail to follow, no matter how faint, he would find it. Walter began his search the very next day. He didn't waste time thinking about what it might lead to or how difficult it might be to uncover the truth. He knew that once he set his mind to something, he followed through. He had always been the kind of man who took responsibility, and this situation was no different. The dog, whose presence had slowly worked its way into his heart, had become his responsibility. It was more than just a stray dog now, it was a symbol of something larger, something that had to be addressed. He went to the local pet store first, asking about the collar, but the salespeople had no idea where it might have come from. They offered their sympathies about the dog's abandonment, but Walter could see the disinterest in their eyes. It wasn't their problem, he knew that, but it didn't stop him from trying. He moved on to the local animal shelter, hoping someone there might recognize the collar or have more insight into the kind of person who might own such an expensive piece of equipment. But again, he came up empty. They had no record of the dog, and no one recognized the monogram. The more he asked around, the more Walter realized that this wasn't going to be easy, but that only fueled his determination further. He took a trip to the nearby town, asking around at local high-end pet stores and boutique shops. Again, the answers were the same. No one recognized the collar, and no one could point him in the right direction. Walter began to feel the weight of the mystery pressing on him, but he refused to back down. If the dog's past was hidden, then Walter would find it. He had worked with his hands for years, creating things that didn't exist before, fixing what was broken, and building what others had left unfinished. He wasn't going to let a few dead ends stop him now. It wasn't until he made a phone call to an old friend from his carpentry days that things began to shift. His friend, James, had once done some work for a wealthy family in the north part of town, and Walter had always thought of him as a good source of information when it came to the more well-to-do residents of the area. Walter explained the situation, asking if he had any idea who might have owned such a custom-made collar. James hesitated, then mentioned a name that made Walter's heart skip a beat: Caleb Remington. Walter knew that name. Caleb Remington was a wealthy property developer, a man whose name had been in the papers for years, associated with high-profile projects and charitable donations. He was the kind of man whose name was synonymous with luxury and success in their small town. Walter had seen his picture in the local news, smiling at charity galas, shaking hands with other influential figures. But he had never imagined that someone like Caleb Remington would be involved in something as cruel as abandoning a dog. Yet, the more Walter thought about it, the more it made sense. The collar, the indifference, the lack of regard for the dog's life, it all pointed to someone with wealth and privilege who saw animals, like everything else, as disposable. Determined to find answers, Walter decided to pay Caleb Remington a visit. He had no idea what he would say or how the confrontation would unfold, but he knew that he couldn't just let this go. It wasn't just about the dog anymore, it was about holding someone accountable for the cruelty they had shown, for the life they had discarded without a second thought. Walter wasn't going to let the silence continue. He wasn't going to let someone like Caleb Remington think they could get away with it. That night, as Walter prepared to confront Caleb, he felt a sense of resolve growing within him. This wasn't just a matter of righting a wrong, it was about standing up to the kind of cold, calculated cruelty that the world too often ignored. It was about ensuring that no one else would ever be allowed to discard a life so easily, not if Walter had anything to say about it. Walter had never been one for confrontations. Throughout his life, he had preferred to let things unfold at their own pace, trusting in time and patience to reveal the truth. He had built a life based on quiet, steady action, never seeking attention or making waves. But as he prepared for the encounter with Caleb Remington, something in him shifted. This wasn't about making a point for the sake of argument or seeking some kind of personal victory. This was about standing up for what was right. It was about confronting the kind of callous cruelty that Walter could not, in good conscience, allow to go unanswered. The days leading up to the confrontation were filled with a quiet, persistent unease. Walter didn't know what he would say when he faced Caleb, or how the encounter would unfold. All he knew was that he had to go. The mystery surrounding the dog's abandonment, the cold indifference with which it had been discarded, had gnawed at him long enough. He wasn't going to let someone like Caleb Remington, someone who had the power to treat another living creature like a disposable object, get away with it. Walter had done his homework. He knew who Caleb was. His name was synonymous with wealth, success, and influence in the community. He was a man who had made a name for himself in the world of real estate and property development, whose photo frequently appeared in the society pages of the local paper, always smiling, always surrounded by people who seemed to hang on his every word. Caleb was used to power, used to getting what he wanted with the snap of his fingers. But Walter wasn't intimidated by that. He had spent years working with his hands, building homes from the ground up, fixing what was broken, and doing the work that others wouldn't. He wasn't afraid of Caleb Remington, or the wealth and status that accompanied him. Walter didn't know what Caleb had seen in the dog, or what had caused him to abandon it so callously, but it didn't matter. Walter had made his decision. He had seen the cruelty in the monogrammed collar, the detached tone of the letter, and the indifference with which Caleb had cast the dog aside. And Walter couldn't live with that. He couldn't walk away and pretend like it was none of his business. He wasn't that kind of man. The day he decided to confront Caleb, Walter dressed carefully. He chose his oldest coat, the one that had been with him for years, familiar, worn, and comfortable. He didn't need to impress anyone. He simply needed to show up. As he made his way to Caleb's estate on the north side of town, Walter's mind raced with questions. What would Caleb say? Would he deny everything? Would he try to brush it off, as if it were some small, inconsequential matter? Walter didn't know, but he knew one thing for sure. Caleb wasn't going to get away with it. Not on Walter's watch. The Remington estate was everything Walter had expected it to be, a sprawling mansion set back from the road, surrounded by tall gates and perfectly manicured lawns. It was the kind of place that shouted wealth, the kind of house where people like Caleb Remington lived their lives behind carefully constructed walls of privilege. Walter had never been here before, and it struck him how much the house seemed to isolate itself from the world, as if it were intentionally designed to keep others out. It was a fortress, a place where those inside could remain untouched by the outside world. But today, Walter wasn't going to be kept out. As he stood outside the gates, looking up at the imposing house, a wave of determination washed over him. He wasn't here to be intimidated. He wasn't here to back down. He was here to do what needed to be done, to stand up for something that mattered. He had already seen enough in his life to know that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the easiest or most comfortable thing to do, but it was the only thing that mattered. Walter walked up to the front door, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. He raised his hand and knocked firmly. There was a pause before the door opened, revealing a well-dressed man in his early 40s, with sharp features and a composed expression. It was Caleb Remington, standing there in front of him, looking every bit the part of the wealthy, polished businessman Walter had seen in the papers. Caleb didn't smile when he saw Walter, didn't greet him with the warmth one might expect from a visitor. Instead, his eyes narrowed slightly, as if sizing Walter up, deciding whether or not he was worth his time. Yes? Caleb's voice was smooth, controlled. There was a coolness to it that immediately put Walter on edge. Walter didn't hesitate. He didn't come here to make small talk or to waste time. He had a purpose, and he was going to see it through. I found your dog, Walter said, his voice steady but firm. The one you left out in the snow. Caleb's eyes flickered with something, surprise, perhaps, or recognition, but whatever it was quickly masked by a smooth, practiced indifference. He didn't answer immediately, instead stepping back slightly to allow Walter into the entryway. As Walter stepped inside, he couldn't help but notice how pristine everything looked, how perfectly designed and maintained the house was. There were no signs of life here, no indication that anyone truly lived in this space. It felt cold, almost sterile, a reflection of the man who lived within its walls. Caleb led him into a formal sitting room, gesturing for Walter to take a seat. Walter didn't sit. He wasn't here to be treated like a guest, he was here to confront Caleb, to demand answers. He stood tall, looking Caleb directly in the eye. "Your dog," Walter repeated, his voice firmer now. "The one you left to freeze. I have him. He's safe, and he's recovering. But I need to know why you abandoned him. Why did you leave him behind like that?" Caleb's face hardened, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes, a brief moment of discomfort that quickly vanished. He stood still for a moment, then gave a slow, almost dismissive shrug. "He's just a dog," Caleb said flatly, his tone suggesting that this wasn't even worth his time. "I didn't have the time for him anymore. I didn't need him. So, I had someone take care of it. It's really not your concern." Walter's jaw tightened. He could feel the anger rising inside him, but he kept it in check. He had learned over the years to control his emotions, to keep his composure when it mattered most. And this mattered. It mattered because Caleb's words were a reminder of how easily lives could be discarded by those who had the power to do so. "It is my concern," Walter replied, his voice low but resolute. "Because you didn't just abandon a dog. You abandoned something that was living and breathing, something that trusted you. And you didn't even think twice about it." For a moment, Caleb didn't respond. He stood there, staring at Walter, his face unreadable. But then, he seemed to relent slightly, lowering his gaze for a moment, as though the weight of Walter's words had finally registered. "I didn't want to deal with it anymore," Caleb said, his voice softer now, but still laced with the same coldness. "The dog had served its purpose. It wasn't useful to me anymore. I didn't want to waste my time." Walter felt a deep, almost physical anger rise in him at those words. It was one thing to be indifferent to an animal, but to openly admit to treating it as if it were an object, something to be used and discarded at will, was a cruelty that Walter couldn't ignore. The silence between them stretched out, and Walter stood his ground, unwilling to back down.
"You don't get it, do you?" Walter said, his voice sharp now. "This isn't about the dog anymore. It's about the way you've treated him, and the way you treat everything and everyone around you. You've been living in a world where you can throw things away when they no longer serve you. But that doesn't work here. Not with me." Caleb's expression finally shifted, his eyes flickering with a mixture of frustration and something else. Perhaps recognition of the truth in Walter's words. For the first time he seemed unsure of himself, and that, more than anything, was what struck Walter the hardest. "I didn't ask for this," Caleb said quietly, his posture sagging slightly, as if the weight of the conversation had caught up to him. "No," Walter replied. "But you're here now, and you need to answer for what you did." The confrontation with Caleb Remington, though brief and tense, had unsettled something deep within Walter. It wasn't the anger or frustration that had propelled him to stand up to Caleb. It was something quieter, something deeper that had rooted itself in his heart since that very first night he had found the dog curled up beneath the bus stop bench. It had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, but now it felt undeniable. The dog had become more than just a stray. It had become a symbol of something larger, a reminder that some things simply couldn't be ignored. Walter had long understood the value of small, quiet acts of kindness. But the encounter with Caleb had opened his eyes to a truth he couldn't ignore. There were times when standing up for what was right required more than just doing the right thing. Sometimes it required defiance in the face of indifference, of cruelty, and of power. As Walter left Caleb's house that afternoon, his heart was a mixture of emotions: anger, frustration, but also a quiet sense of resolve. Caleb had been dismissive, even cold, in his response to Walter's questions. He had tried to justify abandoning the dog, tried to brush it off as something trivial, as though the dog had simply outlived its usefulness. But Walter hadn't let him. He had stood his ground, refusing to let Caleb get away with the cruelty of his actions. Walter had never been one to back down, not when it mattered. And this, in his mind, mattered deeply. The days after the confrontation were filled with a quiet determination. Walter went about his usual routine, working on small projects around the house, caring for the dog, making sure everything was in order, but his mind kept returning to that afternoon. The dog was recovering, slowly but surely, and Walter had already seen the signs of its growing strength. But it wasn't just about the dog anymore. Walter had made a decision that went beyond simply caring for the animal. It was a decision to stand up, to not let the injustice go unchallenged, to make sure that no one, least of all someone like Caleb Remington, could continue to live as if they were untouchable, as if their actions had no consequences. Walter's stand wasn't just about the dog. It was about all the things he had learned over the years, about integrity, about compassion, and about the responsibility each of us has to the lives we touch, whether human or animal. Walter had always been a man of action, a man who did what needed to be done, without fanfare or expectation of reward. But this was different. Standing up to Caleb wasn't something Walter did lightly. It was something that demanded everything he had, the quiet strength of a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty, but who still believed in doing the right thing no matter the cost. In the days following the confrontation, Walter began to notice changes. Not in the dog, but in himself. He felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known in years. It wasn't that Walter had been waiting for something dramatic to happen. It was that this quiet, seemingly small act of standing up to Caleb had unlocked something in him, something that had been dormant for far too long. Walter had lived much of his life in solitude, in quiet resignation, telling himself that he didn't need anyone or anything. But the dog had changed that. The act of rescuing it, of caring for it, had opened his heart in a way he hadn't realized was possible. And now, standing up to Caleb, Walter understood that it wasn't just the dog who needed him. It was the world around him. It was the people and creatures who had no voice, no power, no means of defending themselves against those who would discard them without a second thought. Walter's determination grew stronger with each passing day. He continued to care for the dog with the same quiet, steadfast dedication he always had, but now his heart was fuller, his mind sharper. He knew that he couldn't walk away from this. He couldn't let Caleb's indifference slide by without consequence. The dog had shown him something, the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it meant facing the harsh reality of the world. One evening, as Walter sat in his favorite chair by the fire, the dog resting at his feet, he thought about the letter that had started all of this. It was still tucked away in a drawer, and though he had read it countless times, Walter felt he needed to do something more with it. He had already confronted Caleb, but it wasn't enough. The letter had been a sign, a symbol of the kind of world Caleb inhabited. A world where cruelty could be easily brushed aside, where lives could be discarded without so much as a second thought. Walter wasn't content to let the story end there. There had to be more that could be done, more people who needed to hear the truth. Walter had spent years building things, fixing things, and in the quiet solitude of his home, he had built a life that was simple, but it was his. But now, he realized, it was time to build something bigger than that. A truth that couldn't be ignored, a message that would resonate beyond the walls of his home. He didn't want fame or recognition. He didn't even want to make a big spectacle of it. What he wanted was simple, for the truth to be heard. He wanted people to understand that no life, whether human or animal, was disposable. He wanted them to know that kindness and compassion mattered, that standing up for what was right was always worth the effort, no matter how small the act may seem. Walter's stand wasn't about seeking revenge. It wasn't about punishing Caleb or making him feel bad for what he had done. Walter didn't need that. What he needed was for Caleb, and anyone else who thought they could discard lives without consequence, to understand that there was power in standing up, in making your voice heard. Walter had learned that lesson from the dog. The dog had trusted him, had given him a chance to prove that there was goodness in the world, and Walter wasn't about to let that trust go to waste. Over the next few days, Walter spent time reflecting on his choices, his life, and the path that lay ahead. He knew that confronting Caleb had been just the beginning. There was more to be done. More people to reach, more truths to reveal. But Walter wasn't afraid. He had spent years working in solitude, building his life from the ground up, and now he knew that it was time to build something bigger. The dog had shown him that sometimes, standing up for what's right requires more than just quiet actions. It requires standing firm, even in the face of opposition. It requires saying, "I will not stand by while cruelty goes unchallenged." Walter wasn't just standing up for the dog anymore. He was standing up for everything he believed in, and he knew deep down that this was just the beginning. The story wasn't over yet. In fact, it had only just begun. The days that followed Walter's confrontation with Caleb Remington were quiet ones, at least on the surface. The world outside continued on in its usual pace, the rhythms of daily life carrying on without much regard for the storm that had passed through Walter's life. The snow had melted, the earth beneath it now soft and muddy, and with the change in seasons came a subtle shift in Walter's world. It was the kind of change that couldn't be seen on the outside, not at first, but one that grew deeper over time, like the slow, steady growth of a seed planted in the soil. Walter didn't expect any dramatic shifts after confronting Caleb. He didn't expect applause or recognition, and he certainly didn't expect Caleb to come to some moment of profound self-realization. No, what Walter had done wasn't about that. It wasn't about making a grand statement or forcing anyone to admit fault. It was about standing up for what was right, about doing something because it mattered, even if no one else saw it. And as the days wore on, Walter found that his quiet stand had created ripples in the world around him. Ripples that he hadn't anticipated, but that were nonetheless significant. In the immediate aftermath of the confrontation, there was no loud outcry or public scandal. Caleb didn't come forward to defend himself, nor did he make any public attempts to salvage his reputation. Instead, the silence around him grew louder. He didn't appear at the usual social gatherings or charity events that had once marked his prominence in the community. The wealth and power that had once seemed like impenetrable armor now seemed strangely fragile. Walter noticed the subtle changes. People who had once looked up to Caleb now began to look away. They didn't say anything out loud, but there was a shift in the way they spoke of him. It wasn't that they spoke badly of him. It was that they didn't speak of him at all. It was as if the incident with the dog, though not widely known, had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of those who had once placed Caleb on a pedestal. Walter knew that the story wasn't over, though. It had barely begun. His encounter with Caleb hadn't been about exposing the man's flaws to the world. It had been about Walter standing up for the truth, for something greater than himself. But as the weeks passed, Walter realized that something important was happening. Something that he had not expected. The small, quiet act of standing firm against Caleb's cruelty had created a wave of reflection. People had begun to question things, maybe not directly, but the subtle shifts were undeniable. Walter had done what he could, but it was the ripple effects that would have the lasting impact. One afternoon, a week after the confrontation, Walter received a call that surprised him. It was from a woman he had met briefly at a local charity event years ago. Her name was Claire, and she worked at a local animal shelter. She had heard about Walter's confrontation with Caleb, though not through the traditional means. The shelter had received a letter from someone with the initials C, a letter that seemed to echo the same cold, detached language Walter had read in Caleb's letter to him. The letter had been brief but direct, just like the one Walter had received. It was a statement, an admission really, that the dog was no longer of use to its owner, and that it had been abandoned without thought. The shelter had been shocked by the letter, but it had been Claire's quiet response to it that had caught Walter's attention. She had quietly spread the story to a few people in the community, not in a way that invited confrontation, but in a way that created awareness. Claire had reached out to Walter to thank him for his actions, telling him that his stand had not gone unnoticed. The shelter was working on launching a new campaign to raise awareness about animal cruelty and abandonment, and Walter's quiet courage had given them the spark they needed to move forward. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a reminder that even small acts of resistance could spark change. Walter had been silent when he received the call, absorbing the information slowly. Claire thanked him again for his part in bringing attention to the issue, but Walter wasn't looking for thanks. He wasn't looking for recognition. In fact, he preferred to remain in the background. What mattered to him was that, through his actions, a light had been cast on the cruelty that Caleb had inflicted on the dog. But more importantly, it had cast light on the silence that so often surrounds cruelty, whether it's the abandonment of a dog, or the way people like Caleb could use their power to ignore the consequences of their actions. The next few weeks were marked by subtle changes in Walter's own life. The dog, now officially named Charlie, continued to grow stronger. Its once thin body filled out, and its coat grew thick and glossy. Charlie became a quiet companion in Walter's daily routine, following him around the house, always close but never demanding. The bond between them deepened in ways that Walter hadn't expected. He had never been a man who sought emotional connection, but Charlie had found a way into his heart without effort, simply by being present, by being there in a way that was patient and unwavering. But it wasn't just Charlie who had changed. Walter had changed, too. He felt a quiet sense of pride in his actions, but it wasn't pride in the sense of seeking recognition. It was pride in the simple fact that he had stood up, that he had taken action in a world that so often encouraged silence. He felt a sense of peace in knowing that he had done the right thing, even if it hadn't made a dramatic impact. For Walter, that was enough. One afternoon, as Walter walked Charlie along the dirt path near his home, he noticed something. The once quiet street was now filled with more people, neighbors stopping to chat, a passing smile from the woman down the street. The changes were subtle, but they were there. People had started to look at Walter differently. It wasn't that they were treating him like a hero. It was that they were treating him with a quiet respect, a recognition of the quiet strength it took to stand up for something that mattered. It was a small shift, but to Walter it felt significant. He wasn't trying to be seen, but now, in his own quiet way, he was. And that was enough. It wasn't long before Walter received another letter. But this one was different. It wasn't from Caleb, nor was it from the animal shelter. This letter came from an unexpected source. Someone who had once been part of the world that Walter had avoided. It was from Claire again, but this time the letter was different. The tone was warmer, more personal, and it contained an invitation for Walter to speak at the upcoming charity event that would raise awareness about animal cruelty. It wasn't a request for him to be a speaker, not in the traditional sense. It was an invitation for him to share his story, to let others know why he had stood up for Charlie, and what it meant to make a stand when it seemed easier to remain silent. Walter read the letter twice, his fingers tracing the words. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't wanted to be seen, hadn't wanted to step into the spotlight. Walter sat in his chair by the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance. The quiet crackling of the wood in the stove was the only sound filling the room, a comforting rhythm that had always been present in his life. He took a deep breath, allowing himself a rare moment of peace. Outside, the seasons had shifted again. The winter's chill was now a distant memory, replaced by the budding warmth of spring. The earth was coming back to life, just as the dog, now firmly named Charlie, had come back to life under Walter's care. The dog was no longer the fragile, trembling creature that had been left to die in the snow. It was a strong, confident animal, a steady companion that Walter had come to rely on in ways he hadn't expected. But it wasn't just Charlie who had changed. Walter had changed, too. The events of the past months, the discovery of the dog, the cruel letter, the confrontation with Caleb Remington, had stirred something deep within him, something that had lain dormant for far too long. He had always been a man of quiet action, a man who believed that the small, unseen gestures mattered. But now, with the world around him slowly beginning to shift, Walter realized that some things could not be left unsaid. Some things needed to be spoken, to be shared, no matter how uncomfortable it felt. Walter had spent most of his life building, creating, and fixing things. He had built houses with his hands, raised walls, and constructed homes for others. But now, as he reflected on the journey he had been on, he realized that his work wasn't just about the physical act of creation. It was about building something deeper, something that would outlast the walls and foundations he had crafted. It was about building a legacy that spoke to the values he had lived by all these years, values of integrity, kindness, and responsibility. The resolution had come quietly, but it had come nonetheless. Walter had stood up for what was right, not for recognition, not for accolades, but because it was the right thing to do. And in doing so, he had changed the trajectory of his own life, and perhaps in a small way he had changed the lives of others too. The community had noticed, even if they hadn't said it out loud. The simple act of confronting Caleb Remington had been a ripple in the pond, a disturbance in the quiet waters of their town. It had made people think, made them question the things they had once accepted as normal. Walter hadn't sought to make waves, but his quiet defiance had done just that. The aftermath had been subtle, but it was undeniable. Caleb Remington had retreated from the public eye. He didn't attend the usual galas or charity events, and his presence in the community seemed to fade, like a shadow growing longer and longer until it disappeared altogether. Walter didn't know if Caleb had truly been affected by the confrontation, but he didn't need to. What mattered was that the truth had been spoken, and that it had reached those who needed to hear it. Walter had done his part, and that was enough for him. The dog, Charlie, had become more than just a companion. Charlie had given Walter something that he hadn't realized he had lost: purpose. The dog had been abandoned, thrown away like something disposable, but Walter had given him a second chance. In turn, Charlie had given Walter a second chance, too. The companionship between them had grown deeper, stronger, and more meaningful with each passing day. Walter had always been a solitary man, content to live in his quiet world. But now, He understood that even the quietest lives needed companionship, needed connection. And Charlie had filled that void in a way that was simple, pure, and unspoken. Walter's decision to speak at the charity event, to stand before the community and share his story, had been a pivotal moment for him. It wasn't that he was seeking attention or applause. It was that he had realized that his actions, his stand, could have an impact beyond the walls of his home. When he stood before the crowd, telling them about the dog he had rescued and the man who had abandoned him, he wasn't just telling a story. He was telling them about the power of kindness, about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. He was reminding them that every life matters, that no one, human or animal, should be treated as disposable. And in that moment, Walter knew that he had created something that would outlast him. A legacy of compassion, of courage, and of doing the right thing no matter the cost. The charity event itself had been a success, and Walter had been surprised by the response. People came up to him afterward, thanking him for his words, telling him how much his story had resonated with them. But Walter wasn't interested in their praise. What mattered to him was that the message had been received, that people had been moved to think differently, to act differently. He had never sought recognition, but he had come to understand that sometimes, standing up for what's right requires others to take notice, to see what you're doing and be inspired to do the same. As the weeks turned into months, Walter continued to live his quiet, steady life. He worked on his projects around the house, cared for Charlie, and kept to himself as he always had. But there was something different now. The walls he had built around his heart, the walls that had kept him safe from the pain of loss, had begun to crack. He wasn't afraid of vulnerability anymore. He wasn't afraid to let people in, to share his story and his values. He had come to understand that true strength wasn't in silence. It was in the courage to speak the truth, to stand up when it mattered most. Walter's legacy wasn't about grand gestures or monumental achievements. It wasn't about building the biggest house or making the most money. It was about the quiet, everyday choices that defined a life. It was about standing up for what was right, even when no one was looking. It was about showing kindness when others would turn away. And most importantly, it was about the love and compassion that had blossomed between him and Charlie, a bond that transcended the cruelty and indifference that had once threatened to tear them apart. One afternoon, as Walter sat on the porch with Charlie at his feet, watching the sunset, he felt a deep sense of contentment. The world was quieter now, more peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, Walter felt at peace with himself. He had done what he could. He had stood up for the dog, for what was right, and in doing so, he had found something that he hadn't realized he had lost: purpose, connection, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that his actions had made a difference. His legacy wasn't in the houses he had built or the things he had fixed. It was in the lives he had touched, the kindness he had shown, and the courage he had found within himself to do what was right, no matter the cost. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Walter knew that his story wasn't finished. It wasn't about the past, it was about the future. And with Charlie by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that, no matter what, he had already built something that would last.